Okay, so I'm going to admit now, here's a little bit of a secret. This is kind of my least favorite topic. And it's my least favorite topic in some ways because of how the history of archaeology is often told in textbooks. So you might have noticed towards the end of the notes here that I've snuck in a little bit about women in archaeology because unfortunately a lot of textbooks don't really address this as well as they should. My other problem with histories of archaeology is that it focuses, again, on the kind of big figures and their contributions to the discipline, but it fails to acknowledge the really important contributions of all of their graduate students and local field workers and all of the other people that were part of those larger research programs. So in my opinion, these narratives of how history developed tend to focus on, again, these kind of big men. They largely tend to focus on white men, and they tend to kind of ignore all of the different people that are actually involved in doing archaeology. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more when we talk about fieldwork and we look at the big teams that are involved in these projects. And I can talk about my own experiences in Tanzania, where we're working on these kind of projects that have, again, many different kinds of people involved in doing archaeology. So my approach then when I teach at this introductory level is to focus not so much again on the pioneers, but look at the kind of hows of how archaeology developed. So what we're going to look at is this kind of summary timeline where we're looking at these kind of major events and how and we'll look at some of the reasons of how the shifts went from kind of these large trends over time. So that's really this slide here, is all these kind of advances that then led to archaeology as is practiced today. And I like to summarize them in these kind of 5 big concepts. So first is we need to establish human antiquity, so people as old. And this was because there was a lot of debate, especially with the second point of the development of theory of evolution, as to how old humans actually could be and how long humans had actually been present on the earth. As some of you can imagine, a lot of early ideas around human antiquity were strongly affiliated with religious doctrine and ideology of those times. And so it wasn't until we have kind of key pioneers coming about and using methods like stratigraphic analysis, which we'll talk about later on in the term when we talk about dating techniques, and actually dating techniques in general, that people were able to kind of firmly established that humans have been around for a really significant period of time. And of course, the theory of evolution supported this, the idea that humans and human culture have changed over time. So of course, what we find in the archaeological record doesn't look the same as what's around us today, right? And we talked about this a little bit in previous topics when we kind of introduced the idea of sites, but we'll look at this even more when we start to look at site formation processes and whatnot throughout the term. We also had to have some developments, not just in kind of theories and ideas, but around methods as well. So I've highlighted a few early field techniques that were pioneered that allowed us to establish some of the core concepts that are used in archaeology today, including context. Then we see a shift away from kind of methodology into theory. So how do we interpret the stuff that we're now finding? And then finally, the more recent development, which is development of public archaeology. And we'll come back towards this towards the end of the term. So these are the 5 advances that I want you to frame everything that follows in this PowerPoint around. So in this recorded lecture, I'm not going to go into the details. You can read them. I know it's kind of dry, but I want you to always be thinking about these things. So how did this contribute to the advancement of archaeology and the formation of archaeology as a discipline? Okay, so they're kind of roughly divided into this. So we have some notes on kind of some of the key figures behind the establishment of human antiquity. And you'll see that a lot of the early researchers aren't archaeologists, right? They're coming from biology and more broadly the study of humanity and history. Then later on, and I don't talk about it very much, we get into the work of Charles Darwin. Again, the reason why I don't spend a lot of time talking about it in this class is because you probably get bombarded with this in some of your other courses. Then we get into the first excavations and the beginnings of modern archaeology. And note that what I frame is that really these kind of earliest excavations were not really done by formally trained archaeologists. Like archaeology as a discipline was kind of in its preliminary stages, that most of the people doing this were antiquarians or individuals of mean who had the resources that allowed them to go and dig up sites, collecting objects, in pursuit of collections. So collections for both museums, so ones like the British Museum, and we're going to talk about that in ethics next week, about some of the problems with the collections that currently exist in many museums around the world. And then in other cases, research was done, but it was kind of, again, secondary to the kind of pretty stuff that was being used to fund these excavations. And so I've given you two examples of Napoleon and the Rosetta Stone and the work of Howard Carter, who very famously discovered King Tut's tomb. Then I talk about some actual archaeologists, and it's interesting because General Augustus Lane, Fox Pit Rivers, as I talk about below, wasn't an archaeologist again by training, but just something he was interested in, and he used kind of his success as a man in the military and just kind of a man of means to be able to go and investigate the past, something he was just personally interested in. Sir William Flinders Petrie, an incredibly influential character in archaeology, thanks in large part to his work in Egypt, but he also did work in Palestine as well. And so I talk a little bit about some of the methodologies that he developed. It wasn't just his methods, but what was really great about Petrie was that he also did full publication of all the materials he recovered. So not just the pretty things, not just the intact things, but broken potsherds, etc., that he encountered. And then we get into theory, and so I've provided a little bit of context around how once the kind of what was going on in the past, we start to see shifts in the kinds of questions towards when did this happen, and then finally the why questions. And so what I'm emphasizing here is that theory, although kind of a dry topic, is really important because it informs everything that we do and gives us the ability to justify the destructive practice of archaeology itself. So again, I go into a little bit in terms of what theory looks like prior to the 1940s, and your textbook does a really great job of explaining all these different shifts that occur. I've given you some examples of some of the early forms of interpretation then that developed from these early forms of theory, right? Mainly focused on, again, how do we explain change in the archaeological records. So I've given you some examples, some projectile points here, the processes, and then I have a couple of examples, kind of both positive and negative, of migration and how that actually still can be used to explain the movement type ideas and material culture. And then Great Zimbabwe, which is kind of a negative example of diffusion as an explanation, that how sometimes these colonial racist ideals were used to explain what early archaeologists were seeing in parts of the world like Africa, and how they basically used diffusion to argue that sites like Great Zimbabwe, which is a massive city complex, could not have been developed or innovated in situ, like so in Zimbabwe by Africans, that basically it had to have been an idea that was brought into Africa by Europeans. And so they interpreted the archaeological record or pieces of the archaeological record to support, again, these racist ideologies. And this was because, of course, the colonial government of Zimbabwe was really invested in ensuring that they could still have power and authority over the region, right? And so acknowledging that there was a complex civilization that was present that predated the arrival of Europeans was problematic to these colonial ideologies. And so I talk about that below. Then I start to talk about some of the shifts and other key figures, such as one of my personal favorites, V. Gordon Childe. Then talk about how dating becomes important. And again, we'll do a whole topic on dating techniques. But really it was the development of radiocarbon dating in the 1950s by Willard Libby, or Bill, who allowed us to shift from kind of when things happened in the past to why they did. Then I talk about the new or processual archaeology and how it was different from the post-processual archaeologies of the 80s and 90s, which then leads us into archaeology as being done today. And so in the rise in the late 90s, early 2000s of public archaeologies, including the explosion of cultural resource and cultural heritage management at this time. And remember, these are one of the key types of archaeology that we're going to look at this term. And then here's my little bit about women in archaeology. So I've selected a few pioneering individuals. Here, I'll just move my face so you can see Tatiana Proskoryakov here. Mary Leakey, of course, has heavily influenced the research that I do because she actually pioneered the Stone Age system that we use in East Africa to this day. Kate and Thompson and Dorothy Garrod are just like amazingly awesome, kick-ass women. Same with Kathleen Kenyon. I mean, these are female archaeologists who like were first female professors of any field of study at universities like Oxford and Cambridge, like really significant figures, not just in archaeology, but in terms of advancing archaeologists, females and women as professionals, as academics. This web here I just included because it's really interesting, and I won't know this before, when we start to look at how these women knew and interacted and mentored and supported each other. And this is a really different narrative than the kind of linear, again, great man narrative we get about archaeology in the past, right? That it was like these stunningly key figures who came along and changed and revolutionized everything. And what we see when we look at the kind of female perspective of the development of archaeology as a discipline, that instead these women were all interacting with each other, communicating with each other, working on projects with each other, mentoring each other. And that's really powerful and significant because often that's how archaeology is done today, is based on these systems of networks. And then I think and then I give you some resources if you want to get more familiar with these Indiana Jones or women in archaeology. And keep in mind that this is a major theme that we talk about in my Anth 320 class, or Archaeologies of Gender, which is scheduled for next term. And then our summary. So hopefully I've kind of tweaked some interesting ideas for you and kind of livened up, which is often seen as a dry topic. But I think, again, if you focus on these major themes versus the kind of specific details of who did what and when, I think you get a better picture, a more nuanced picture of the development of archaeology as a discipline.